Well, hello everybody. Thought we'd do something a little different today and record a conversation with a guest and put it out there for everyone. Hi, my name's Philip Davidson. I'm with the BCPS Employees for Freedom Society. We're a registered not-for-profit society in British Columbia. We're a group of nonpartisan professional public servants, government employees, people who are current and former employees of governments at all levels in British Columbia, provincial, municipal, and federal. And we wanted to have a conversation with our guest tonight because she's been putting out some really great videos, and one in particular that we want to get into in some detail about a topic that we think will be of interest to a lot of people. Um, but I do just want to mention that our society is currently fundraising for some litigation on behalf of employees of the BC Public Service who were affected by the province's proof of COVID-19 vaccination mandate and rather terminated or forced out of employment. And there is class action certification hearings upcoming in April of this year in Victoria, BC. And so we ask if that's something that you support to go to our website to donate to support that litigation. We won't be able to do it without the support of others, but we do believe it's very important legal principles at stake regarding the medical privacy and bodily autonomy of all people, and in this case particularly public servants. Um, we wanted to invite our guest, Melanie Bennet, who is something of an advocate in the education space in Canada, and have this conversation about the important role that unions play in Canada. Um, BCPSEF's relationship to unions is sort of born out of the whole COVID experience and the abject failure of unions to protect the rights of their members. Um, Melanie's interest is more on the education side. But about a week and a half ago or so, Melanie recorded a live stream watch party, I think she called it, about a documentary that she watched and kind of critically analyzed and reviewed while watching it about the history of the Communist Party of Canada. And if you haven't watched that video yet, maybe now's the time to pause this video and go watch that one because we will be discussing that documentary in depth here. I just wanted to bring Melanie in, and maybe Melanie, welcome, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what got you interested in this topic.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to your show. Well, I guess you could say I'm an advocate. I am a regular citizen, a parent, pardon me, who very much stumbled upon doing a lot of this investigative work that I've been doing, mostly in education, but that sort of led me to other areas. Like you mentioned the unions, that obviously led me down into the rabbit hole of unions. But I just started off noticing that there were some things that were a little bit funny. I had the impulse of going to read the source material. And when I say source material in terms of education, all these policies are published. And so people can go read them, whether it's your Ministry of Education or whether it's your particular school board or even your school. So I went to read these sorts of things and I noticed an awful lot of very funny things in there, very ideological sounding things. So that sort of led me on the path of figuring out what on earth all of this ideology is and doing my best to translate it for people and make it accessible. I first thought if I just pointed to the document, people would read it. That obviously wasn't the case. And so I make videos kind of unpicking this and showing people where they can find the information, but explaining a little bit of what it is. And that's kind of how I came on to this, to just having a YouTube channel and making videos about it.
Yeah, and so tell us, you've got a beautiful accent, I might say. But you are Canadian, but you've lived abroad for many years, or you were raised, I believe, in the UK. Tell us about that.
Yeah. I am Canadian. I am also English. I was a child. I was born in the east of Canada. I grew up in the Ottawa, Montreal area, and I just lived in the UK most of my life after that. And I came back. Well, I came to the GTA region, so I live in the GTA at the minute, and I took a job in the GTA when my son started high school. It was a good time to go. He always wanted to live in Canada. So, I took a career job here. And that was part of my awakening to this too, because I think I discovered what woke was without fully understanding what that was for a little while down the line, because I hadn't really come across a lot of that in the UK. But yeah, so I'm sort of a citizen who has experience living in different countries. So it was pretty, I think I remember calling friends and family in the UK weeks after moving here and saying, there's just something really odd. I can't put my finger on it, but there's something a little bit odd. Something's off. I think that's what I was saying. It was off. So yeah, it was a bit of a shock. That was in 2017. I think I didn't mention that.
So it's been a few years, and it's often interesting. People come, with a different perspective or like experience elsewhere, and they're able to compare that with what they're, seeing and living here in Canada, as opposed to people who've been here all their lives and maybe absorb a lot of what's going on, but don't kind of recognize that might
Well,
be
it's the
off,
frog
like you
boiling in
say.
the pot, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Um, well, let's maybe get right into the documentary then. So, for everyone, and the links, to that Melanie's review of the documentary will be in the description to this video, and then the link to the actual documentary itself. But the documentary was produced and put out 4 years ago, I guess, 2021, by the Communist Party of Canada, and is called A Century of Struggle: The Story of the Communist Party of Canada. And, it's probably good to put a little caveat here about, why are we talking about the Communist Party of Canada? It's not really a political force of any significance in Canada. I think it's a registered political party, but hardly has any sort of support electorally. But I think, as we get into it, and as the documentary shows, the significance of the influence of the Communist Party and their beliefs and socialist ideology on Canadian labor unions is very significant. And and so that's what's worth talking about it. Uh,
Yeah, so I came across I'd heard about this documentary, and you have to take it with a pinch of salt because it is a documentary produced by the Communist Party of Canada. So there's going to be some ideological bent in there, but there's also some historical information which is really, really useful. But in passing in my travels, I had heard that this documentary existed, and I thought, oh, I should watch that one day. And then it sort of came up on my feed, and that was the day that I'd done this sort of watch party, I guess. I don't really do live streams, but I was like, I have to watch this live with other people because I knew that it would contain some information about unions. That's how I learned that this documentary existed. But as it turns out, even though it's a Communist Party documentary, it's almost like a history of how unions became infiltrated with communists, basically. I mean, that's what the documentary really is about. And I'll just start off by saying it's very clear watching this that unions were not always socialist. Like that is very, very clear. Because we hear a lot nowadays that, oh, unions have always been socialist. And when I started looking into it, that's kind of what I thought because it's workers for workers and people organizing. You kind of associate that specifically with communism or socialism, but that's not the case. And that's what I found really, really, really interesting is that it is really a history of how the communists specifically infiltrated the various unions and the fights that they had over the decades too. And because it wasn't always successful.
exactly, and that's what I found so fascinating about it too. And, like talking about communism nowadays, it seems like kind of anachronistic. Like, isn't that like such a 20th century thing? That was the Soviet Union and they collapsed and we kind of moved on and so forth. But like these beliefs and this ideology kind of has continued on within these organizations, these unions. And most of the people interviewed in this documentary, I'm going to get into a few of them in a minute, are trade unionists. So
Yes.
they're members of unions and big time labor leaders, and they talk about the 100 years of history of their activity in the Canadian labor movement. And um, so let's just maybe I'll just get to some of their comments, Melanie, and you can like expand on that and kind of tell me what you think about what they talked about in the documentary. And it's important. So um, one of the first people interviewed in the documentary is a trade unionist from BC, Sam Hammond. He's former BC Communist Party leader and former Communist Party Labor Secretary. And he talks about how the labor movement is the organized working class. It's not the whole working class, but it's the organized working class. And that for the communists, it's a training ground for class consciousness.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
and that like the labor movement by itself, and these are quotes from documentary, would never take up the fight for socialism. The labor movement, if left alone, would become economism, what Lenin called economism. So what did you think about when you heard those remarks by Sam Hammond?
I just want to start off by saying I am by no means an expert on unions or communism. I have just fallen into this out of curiosity, but I've come across a lot of it over the past couple of years. So I can only speak from a layman's perspective, somebody who has interest. But I picked up on that very early on, yeah, that what I understood, well, first of all, I just want to say BC is very represented in this documentary heavily. So BC it's, there's a lot of that in there. But my first impression when I heard that is that the unions were not, first of all, the unions were not always communists, but that the communists need the unions to sort of as a training ground for the ideology. I mean, that's what I heard when I first heard that. Is that what you understood from what he was saying as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think those were his literal words. It's the labor movement is a training ground for class
Oh, there you go. See,
consciousness.
I'm just repeating
And
him now.
yeah, and I was like, I was really struck. And so, they have a political project, communists do, and that's to, create the conditions or sort of implement socialism.
Yeah.
And you also point out in the documentary that, communists and Canadian Communist Party are internationalists. So they're not national socialists, but like international socialists, or you could say global socialists nowadays. So they have a project that they seem to want to bring about globally, which is socialism, I guess, leading to communism. Maybe it's helpful to like define how do you understand socialism and communism? What do you understand those concepts to
I
mean?
think that's a really complicated question, and the reason I'm saying that is because there's so many different types from what I've observed. I mean, obviously, the Communist Party is Marxist-Leninist, and so they're the whole scientific Marxism, right? So they're very doctrinal. They follow all the writings of Marx and Engels and all the experiment within the Soviet Union. So that is one faction, and the Communist Party itself is that. And I think some of it is that. And I think most people think of when they think of communists, they or socialist, well, actually just communists. When they think of communists, they think of Marxist-Leninist, and that is a thing. But that has moved on over time. Now, my introduction to really looking into this wasn't from a Marxist-Leninist perspective. I came into this through queer theory, which you wouldn't think is associated with Marxism, but it is tangentially. And through education as well, then you have other types which are feminist in orientation, or there's even postmodern links with Marxism in there as well, or neo-Marxism. And so there's so many, like, the thing is, these things evolve over time. So it's hard to define just one kind of thing. I think James Lindsay explained it as there's species and genres, right? So I'm just saying there's a lot.
Yeah.
Today, I think I'm not sure exactly if all the infiltration within the unions is just purely Marxist-Leninist, because you have enough, like there does seem to be very identitarian, this postmodern neo-Marxist sort of approach or this intersectionality that people call it, right? So that's a very different kind. And in fact, the Marxist school is going on in Montreal this weekend, I think, with all of the Marxist-Leninists. And I was just looking on their page just before coming on here. And they're having a discussion at their Marxist school about whether or not queer theory is really Marxism, or whether intersectional or the fashion for intersectionality can fit into the Marxist revolution. And so even within their grouping, I guess the far leftist different types of thinking, they're even having those arguments. But so I find that very, very difficult to define. I think my personal feeling is that this new version, this intersectionality, that there's undeniably a foundation that comes from a sort of critical theory, neo-Marxist, that sort of post-war kind of getting away from the old kind of Marxist, to like an old left to a new left. So there is that, but it involves also this sort of progressivism, which is like a new, like an advancement of liberalism as well. So yeah, it's very, I'm just saying it's very hard to define, but I think the intersectionality that Canada seems to be gripped with isn't just a pure Marxism at all. There's affinities with that, but it also involves this sort of progressivism as well.
Yeah, there's a lot going on at the moment, and there's many different strands to this. I think, if we go back to like the original Marxism, it's more like focused on economics and the means of production and the collective ownership of that. And
Well, there's
um,
also rebuilding a new man, right?
okay, so there's kind of also like a spiritual element to all of this too. Like that's what I like kind of regard socialism as like a secular religion, and you can kind of see that in people that they're really propelled forward by this very sincere belief, in the ideology, and it really motivates them to work hard towards achieving their ends, which is that kind of again, collective ownership, as they describe it, of the means of production. So basically, like state nationalization of industries, abolition of private property, these kinds of things. So very different from if you contrast that with like classical liberalism, where it's more about protection of private property and um, you know uh,
Yeah, that's so you have that economic side, right? So I think
yeah.
most people think of socialism or Marxism or communism, think of that. And then you have the spiritual side, this whole remaking new man. You could mold man into like a socialist being, right? That's kind of what Marx called it as well. But one thing that's really important too is that even in Marx and Engels' texts, they describe that socialism, you can't go just directly to communism, right? No communism has ever been tried is a true thing because you have to use the capitalist state to build socialism on top of that in the direction of communism. So when you hear communism has never been tried, that's what they're saying. But somehow this idea of socialism has this veneer of respectability where communism doesn't. And even I didn't understand this even a couple of years ago, that socialism is just the path to communism. That's what it is. Right. So whenever we're talking about but socialism is different, democratic socialism, well, no, it's not, because it's still the same idea going in the same direction. And Marx wrote about that even with his own texts. But then you have this whole cultural side to it. Eric Kaufman, in his he wrote a book 12, The Great Awakening, and he really does describe this melding of this like this liberalism that sort of morphed into progressivism that sort of then took on all of these neo-Marxist ideas from the new left, the 60s onwards. And he calls it cultural socialism.
Mhm.
And that's kind of, I think, what we're seeing. Well, we definitely have economic socialism in Canada, but you also have this sort of cultural socialism, that intersectionality, right? This
Mhm.
idea that men can become women and it's all socially constructed.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I want to get into like, how the unions kind of connect in with all of that. But maybe just going back and closing out the discussion around economics, because this was kind of crucial to the, early days of the labor movement in Canada, and then the influence of the Communist Party and Communist Party members. Um, and this idea of economism, like that originally, I guess, labor unions weren't necessarily synonymous with socialism or communism. There was members and leaders of unions that were, I guess, primarily focused on just advocating for their members and workers' rights and having good working conditions and so forth. But like this larger political project that communism was not necessarily of interest to them, and that's why they were criticized by communists, and they had battles with them, big fights. Communism being a very militant ideology. And so, like, I had to look this up, like economism, what does that mean? So I found, like on Wikipedia talks about it. So for what it's worth, Wikipedia says economism refers to the distraction of working class political activism from a global political project to purely economic demands. The concept encompasses rewarding workers in socialism with money incentives rather than incentivizing workers through revolutionary politics. The term is originally associated with Vladimir Lenin's critique of trade unionism. So I just thought that was fascinating that this was happening again, 100 years ago in the 1920s in Canada.
Yeah, I found that really interesting as well because I actually put in I don't know if we could go into this story, but when there was the Million March for Children, this is when I really woke up to what's going on with unions. So I, in my mind, had this idea that unions were maybe this economism style where they were interested in protecting workers' rights. And so they would advocate for better pay, better working conditions, maybe mediate disputes and things like that. That's kind of what I thought unions were. And I'm like, that's great. And then around the Million March for Children, there was a Zoom call that was released to the public. And in that Zoom call could not be the most ideologically full-on communist group of union execs from across the country, but mostly in Ontario. And it included people even like Lana Payne. Now, Lana Payne is the president of Unifor, but also several other big execs running some of these mega unions and smaller unions. There was the Canadian Labour Congress. I mean, like you name it, they were in it. And I went through that call so many times and I even transcribed it word for word. I identified I think I managed to identify 128 people who attended this call because I was like, this can't be legal. There's no way that unions, people of, presidents of locals, presidents of the biggest unions in the country could get together and organize against normal, ordinary citizens who were simply engaging in their democratic right to protest peacefully. I couldn't believe this was an actual thing. Defaming them too, like the way that they were speaking about those parents. I mean, it was unbelievable. So if you haven't seen this call, please go listen to this call. They hate the fact that it keeps getting brought up. But anyway, so I took the time to say, how can I actually make a complaint about this thing that has to be completely illegal? So I made a complaint to the Ontario Labour Relations Board for 15 unions who participated in that call, including the IBEW, the steelworkers, right? Because one of the members of that union, Galen Crampsey, was sent as a seasoned activist, as they call it within that call, to one of the protests to beat up on a 16-year-old kid. He was just there to cause violence. That was discussed in that call that they were going to do that. So it's like they're inciting violence, they're defaming normal people, and they're organizing, using their union money, their union dues to go and organize against normal citizens. So the results of this complaint was surprising, but not surprising. But the fact, and they used their big union lawyers against just this little old me from this complaint. They spent a lot of money, which made me happy. But the result was they did nothing illegal. And that really surprised me because I don't think. So this is kind of what to bring it back to the documentary, that struck me in the documentary that they were the communists who took over the unions were internationalists. They were globalists, if you want to call it that. And so their interest is, yes, workers' rights. Like that is part of it. That's, I guess, the bread and butter. But the ultimate goal, as they describe in the documentary, really is a socialist revolution. I mean, that's the entire point. So they have to they have to address social issues. They have to do the protesting on wars or whatever it is that you can think of, including if they think that a group of so-called right-wing extremists, which is regular parents, are going against their ideology, which in this case would have been gender ideology in schools. So it's their duty to use their resources to squash this fascist uprising as they would see it, right? And that's legal. They have managed over the decades to create a situation where that it is within their legal capacity to do that. And that's one thing. So if anybody can go look up this complaint, and I'm sure I don't know if you can see the responses from the unions, but they describe it in there that no, that's their duty. That's their role. Their role is to engage in social activism, even if it's within, okay, so even if it's within their, against their own members, because some of their own members were at those protests, right? And ordinary members of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people, maybe in the last few years, have that aren't sort of ideologically motivated become more aware of these issues and these kind of conflicts and disputes that are brewing in Canadian society, and kind of are maybe asking themselves, like, where is this coming from? Like, all of a sudden, this is
Unions have a
bizarre.
lot of power in this
Exactly,
country.
and I think that's what this documentary kind of reveals, that not only that, they have a lot of practice, many decades, 100 years of practice, agitating and being involved militantly and sometimes quite violently in social conflicts to further their aims. And so maybe just getting back to that, just go a little bit more into the history so people are aware. If you don't have time to watch the documentary, you're just watching this conversation. Um, Again, the documentary interviews these big time labor leaders, a lot of them in BC, and most of them from BC, I think.
Yeah.
One of them is Dave Pritchett, who's a BC trade unionist with a retired longshoreman. He was the grandson of a communist who came to Port Moody, BC, when he was 7 years old with his father. And so he's like a fourth generation Communist Party member. Um, and his grandfather was the founding president of International Woodworkers of America. As he says in the documentary, most of his friends were fellow travelers and members of the Communist Party, and that the foundations in this movement were built back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. He talks about experiences with American labor leaders, and the fact that actually the Communist Party of Canada was so influential in building unions not only in BC and Canada, but also down through the United States
Yeah.
as well. So I just think that's really interesting. There's this long-standing relationships, particularly like in the west coast of Canada, the west coast of the United States. You can see how that kind of manifests politically, socially, culturally nowadays. Um, but yeah, it's really just impressive to see the pedigree, and to realize that no, this isn't kind of happened suddenly. This has been happening, for a very long time, incrementally at times, in kind of greater spurts. And we're kind of at that moment where it's coming out into the open that this, the militants within that have taken over unions are using the power of those unions, the taxation power essentially they have over the members that are required to pay in. So when you go to work for an employer in a unionized workplace, you're required to pay dues to the union. And it's interesting because we have a lot of unions in Canada. We have a lot of people employed by the government in Canada.
Yeah.
I think 25% of all working Canadians work for the government in one way or another in the public sector. And most of those people are represented by unions, public sector unions. And so millions and millions of dollars are going into these organizations, and they're being used by the people at the top, the leaders who subscribe to this ideology, this belief system, to further their political, social aims. And many of those workers would otherwise not contribute to those causes or necessarily believe in. They're there to work. They want to make a good life for them, living for themselves and their families, but they don't subscribe to this ideology, yet they are required to pay to further it.
Yeah.
And then instances like COVID, where their union is ostensibly there to represent them and represent their interests, like for around medical privacy or bodily autonomy, the unions who are taking their money then go and collaborate with the employer to enforce mandates that rob them of those rights, and then they try and cover it up and use all of their expensive lawyers and everything to do it afterwards. So it's an utter betrayal of the working class, and it actually oppresses the working class.
Yeah.
And it's the exact opposite of what you would think, unions are supposed to do.
Oh, I'll give another story. which I think illustrates that unions don't care about their members. Like that's not why the union bosses are union bosses. Since October 7th, CUPE, which I believe is the largest public sector union, are they the largest, CUPE?
Probably
The
nationally.
president here in Ontario, Fred Hahn, has made himself quite famous for coming out and supporting Hamas very early on, and has been a staunch, I guess, pro-Palestine campaigners out there with CUPE quite a bit since the whole incident in Israel and Palestine and all that. But that's not really what I want to talk about. The reason I'm bringing up Fred Hahn is because of his advocacy for Palestine and his overt anti-Semitism in the eyes of some, he was told off in a viral video by our labor minister, Dave Piccini, and told him to stop being so anti-Semitic, which I thought was kind of interesting. But it goes beyond that. There was a complaint made against Fred Hahn by the Jewish members of CUPE, I believe, here in Ontario. And they really tried to campaign to have Fred Hahn removed from power because he wasn't representing his Jewish members. There was many, many complaints from the Jewish members. Now, the ideological faction of CUPE in Ontario managed to create a huge. Basically, they gathered all their most ideological people to vote for keeping Fred Hahn in place, and he stays there to this day. So they have this capacity to really mobilize some of their most ideological followers for some reason and get rid of the small faction of people who don't want what's going on. So there's like a lot of difficulty with, like, if you're having a problem with your union, it's very, very difficult to do something about it, right? I'm not in a union. I understand that they really do vote a lot. There's a lot of sort of democracy that goes on there. But from that struggle, I guess if you want to call it, the Jewish members against Fred Hahn, I can see how difficult it can be if you want to overhaul what's going on with unions. But that said, I do think the majority, or I have the feeling that the majority of union members are not actually ideological at all. And somehow, if those people got together and actually voted against what's going on, that would be quite spectacular.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's been my experience. I have been a member of a union in my public sector employment as it was required. But I, like probably 97 or 98, 99% of other members in the union, really paid no attention to it. If you had a problem at work, with your boss, you could call on the shop steward to intervene and, represent you in some kind of negotiation, arbitration, or grievance against your employer. But most people are usually just kind of put their head down, get their work done, and really have no need, especially in a public sector, like if you're working for the government or so forth. I mean, these are pretty good jobs. They're not exactly oppressive. They come
Hmm.
with pretty good pay and benefits. Like I think, the Canadian dream is like to have a secure government job with a defined benefits pension, right? That's why 25% of the employed Canadians work somehow in the public sector, and it's a favorite. But yeah, certainly, these battles that happened 100 years ago, 75 years ago, 50 years ago in the labor movement for control of it and the financing mechanism that it has through union dues have led to a state of affairs where these unions are almost untouchable, kind of from within, from members who might disagree with them. And there's interesting comments in this documentary about that, about battles at convention floors, and there's a white bloc, so i.e. a
Yeah.
non-communist bloc that is, trying to go a certain direction, and then the communists are like, no, 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 you're not going to win. We're going to, and they prevail, to the point where they're if you have a problem with your union, it's very difficult to make a claim against them. You have to go through a labor arbitration process. It goes to a labor relations board of some kind in the province jurisdiction you're in. And often, those boards are, the members of those boards are appointed by, union-friendly governments and so forth. And so, they're not exactly there, and they're not exactly neutral, shall we say. They come from the union world themselves. So, um, so it's an almost possible state of affairs if you're in this organization, you're required to pay into it, and then you find out that it's not representing you and actually may be working against you or your interests.
Yeah, there
Um,
does seem to be things within the union that make it seem that way. Like I learned that there's such a thing called flying squads. Do you know what flying squads are?
I have heard the term in
Okay,
connection
so
with
fly.
certain environmental movements here in BC. Yeah.
Well, tell me if this rings true to you. So I know within several unions, or even across different unions, so there's collaboration between unions also, is that they have these basically these individuals who sign up to a squad called a flying squad that can be called at any moment to go protest like this, right? So they're sent somewhere very, very, very quickly. So there's all of these, and I'm sure there's more than just flying squads, but that's something I learned through that Zoom call that I was talking about earlier. So they have all these mechanisms within the union to sort of appear instantly and fight things instantly and go after things. So there's all these power structures that kind of work against you, but that's by no means the majority of the union. These are still kind of smaller individual groups. It just looks very, very powerful. And what I would, I'm not in a union and I don't know what it's like to be in it, but it's clear to me, and especially after watching that documentary, that they don't have to be this way. And if ordinary citizens who first need to understand what's going on, even within your own union and across the unions, right, ideologically speaking, but you can vote against it. But the problem with that, well, I guess problem, the difficulty, I suppose you could say, is that that has to happen in really big numbers because they will be working against you. Just recently, I was in a Unifor training, and I recorded a bit where these two trainers for this upcoming election at some point, they were saying that they were trying to get rid of the conservative or get their conservative uniform members to move slightly to the left, right? So they're trying to make them leftists so that they wouldn't dare spout their conservative opinions, as they say. So they're really trying to get people to not be so-called conservative or whatever. But even if you're centrist, like the politics don't matter. What I'm saying is if you don't want your union to be trying to overtake society, as it were, you can vote against it. But I wanted to talk about something a little bit different as well, because I've noticed in the recent panic over Donald Trump and the 51st state and the tariffs and all of these things. And here in Ontario, we're also having a provincial election. So there's a lot going on in Ontario. And one of the things that struck me is how quickly the unions, including Unifor, who clearly don't like their conservative members and have said so in their little trainings, were willing, how quickly they were willing to attach to the Progressive Conservative Party and the Liberal Party right now to show this strength, this unity. And while this is happening, there's this whole fight, I think is in Quebec, where Amazon decided to leave, and now the unions want to forcibly take over industry, or like there's all this stuff happening with unions at the minute that are really, in my opinion, showing they're trying to show their power or exercise their power and gain more control. And I hope that people are noticing this, because I don't think it's a mistake when the prime minister comes out and says, we're here to protect workers. What he means is he's there with his union exec friends to access more power for them. Like that's how I'm understanding it after looking into this for the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think, it's no secret just how politically active the unions are. But it may come as a surprise to people when you dig into it further, just like how much influence they wield, how much money they donate to political parties, or how much money they spend on elections. Like it was revealed this not long ago here in BC, we had an election in October that like public sector unions spent millions on negative advertising. So to the benefit of the current governing NDP party, who they're obviously very closely aligned. NDP is the party of the Labour Party of the unions. Um, but there isn't really any kind of like organized counterbalancing, force to that. I mean, so, you have people who are working in these different organizations, they're paying their dues to the union, and those millions of dollars are going to elect certain governments that those members may or may not support. But like again, it comes back to that level of participation. Like you're saying, they're supposed to be democratic organizations where the members have a say, you have to be involved, but most people don't get involved. Like most people just kind of forget about it. It comes off their paycheck, and those, interested parties, the 1%, get in there and kind of control all of that. And that's kind of what we're left with.
But they
So
rely on that. Like this is
yeah,
what I've come to understand.
yeah,
Look, we as the collective we, sorry to use the word collective, but as a country, each individual has a duty, a civic duty to understand what is going on and to participate. Now, I don't just mean watch the CBC at night. I mean, actually, like this is a frustration that I came across for myself initially, but then everybody else is that through education is why didn't I read these documents sooner? Why did I just trust? So there's a shirking of our own civic duty because we want to go to work and come home and buy our food shop and take our kids to the whatever cinema on the weekends, right? We just want to have our regular life. But that pacified life has led us to be here. We have to take responsibility. And it can be difficult when talking about topics like this. For example, we're talking about the communist takeover of Canada, which is undeniable. When you look into it, it's pretty clear that there's this revolution going on behind the scenes, or at least a power grab by certain individuals, right, of a far leftist bent. It makes you sound like a conspiracy theorist. And there's a laundering of the what's the word I'm looking for here? It's like socialism and communism have sort of hidden that influence. They've managed to make it look like it's not there. And if you talk about it, then you're just a crazy conspiracy theorist. But the evidence is all around if you just lift the cover and investigate, right? I hate to say do your own research, but do your due diligence. Like the information is out there. But I'm going off on one a little bit here because I feel like somehow when I talk to people, I want to impart in them that we all have a civic duty. We have to get involved in one way or another, whether it's informing yourself or if you're a member, if you're a union member, then you have to know what's going on in your union and vote because the people who want the power, the people who want to have control and all this stuff, they will be voting, they will be organizing, they will be doing that. And I think, unfortunately, in this country, in Canada, people have been very comfortable for a very long time. And the people who wanted that power have been very, very effective at acquiring it over a long period of time. And now we're going, oh, hey, why is Canada a bit funny? Well, it's because everyone just sort of let it happen in a way, right? We all just want to live our lives.
yeah, exactly. And whereas the interested activists have been busy beavers, working way
Very busy.
hard to steer things in the direction that they want to see them go. Maybe it's worth because it's kind of touched on, and they talk a lot about in the documentary, the communists do, about democracy, and what they mean by democracy, and that actually kind of maybe means something different than what a classical liberal might mean by democracy. How do you see that or read that?
Yeah, I've come to understand well, specifically for communists, they mean the dictatorship of the proletariat, basically. Um, Democracy doesn't mean the same thing. So union probably is a the way that the unions are now, I think is probably a good description of what they mean by democracy, right? So everything votes on everything all the time, and there's committees about everything all the time, and you can see how Canada is kind of run like that right now. There's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of committees, there's a lot of interest groups, and there's voting on things all the time, and there's all this bureaucratic process. That's kind of what they mean by democracy, right? Which is a little bit different from like a constitutional democracy, which is what Canada is supposed to be, as far as I understand. I'm
Yeah,
not
I mean,
describing this very well, but it's not. There is a different. So I actually went to the launch, I guess you could say, of the Revolutionary Communist Party in Toronto last April because I was curious. I wanted to go talk to them because I noticed there was these young, idealistic, communist kids, and I wanted to go learn from them what are you doing? And that's kind of how they described it to me, is that for them, democracy really just meant the dictatorship of the proletariat, where everyone votes on everything all the time. Now, this is very idealistic, and it's not really what happens in real life. In real life, it ends up being a small group of very, very determined power-seeking individuals who will take over this so-called democratic process. But in their minds, in the idealistic mind, it's this idea that everyone will vote on it's like full democracy all votes all the time on everything. We're all going to be liberated because the workers have all of the power all the time. It's just that that's not how it actually works out. What we're seeing in Canada is how it works out.
Yeah, there's a big difference between the theory and the practice, and I think we've seen over a century of communism and socialism around the world that it leads to a very stark centralization of power, in the hands of few people that make very, significant decisions about what happens in society, about, people's access to work and, you know, private property and, redistribution of wealth and all that sort of thing. And so, that's very different from like a classical liberal where it's like more of a decentralization of power, representative democracy, a rule of law, and individual participation. So you have freedom, but you have responsibility to participate in that system to, hopefully preserve it over time. You kind of remarked on how as Canadians, we just kind of want to sit back and go to our jobs and, take care of family and stuff, and not really participate that much. And I think we have, pretty, in many cases, dismal, low voter participation or participation in, local democracy or what have you. So it
I want
leaves a
to add,
void for people
this
to
isn't
fill.
just a problem in Canada, okay? This is a
Mm,
problem in the UK too. Um, there has been a lot of apathy in the UK, I think, politically for a long time. Again, I blame myself. This was me up until not that long ago. But just recently, I was listening to some talks of the Fabian. So the Fabian Society is a kind of socialist society that underpins the Labour Party in the UK, and they've been going on since like 1850 or something like that. And they have a meeting every year, or a conference every year. And this year, Wes Streeting, which is the health minister in the UK, he was interviewed or gave a speech, and then he was interviewed afterwards, and he was asked, "Well, Donald Trump and Nigel Farage, we know what their politics are, and it's not very clear what progressive politics are. Could you describe what that is?" And Wes Streeting, a Labour minister at the Fabian Society, was describing that the fundamental principles of progressivism for him and the Labour Party had never changed, that it meant the redistribution of wealth and power, and that was their fundamental principle. And he said this very clearly. I put it on my Twitter. And it's like I only know of one kind of politics that it is fundamentally about the redistribution of wealth and power. And people think that's a liberal party. It's not. It's a socialist party. And they're telling you very clearly what their intentions are. And there has been a laundering of the impression of what socialism is. And I think, unfortunately, in Western countries, we're coming face to face with it right now. And I'm hoping that people start looking into it a little bit more because I don't want to live under more socialism, frankly. I don't think it's been very good for Canada.
Yeah, it hasn't been very good for freedom in general
No.
since its, advent. Um, as a society that has freedom in its name, I think that's a value that we, all of our members, share. And we've kind of lived under the illusion for a while that would continue on in Canada, like unmolested. Um, but those of us who've kind of lived through the experience the last 5 years and been affected, very profoundly by mandates or, loss of employment, things like that, um, kind of have come to see that. But, and, we're not so sure that the rest of the population is aware if they haven't been, personally affected. But now we're in this predicament with, Canada's largest trading partner. And it's very interesting, how these tariffs have been motivated, or at least, are said to be motivated by Trump about fentanyl production and lack of border security and that sort of thing. Um, and you think about other things that have been going on in Canadian politics, and the unions and being underpinned by this revolutionary Marxist sort of Communist Party ideology that's internationalist in scope, and so looks to other Marxist socialist movements around the world for inspiration and support or collaboration and so forth. And the biggest most powerful one would be the People's Republic of China, and the Communist Party of China. And there is a lot of revelations that have been coming out about their influence in Canadian politics. We had a whole foreign interference inquiry just recently related to that. There's been many years of documentation, journalistic reporting about the introduction of fentanyl precursors, particularly in British Columbia, in Vancouver, and the ports. Um, and you just brought up the Fabian Socialist Society and their relationship to the Labour Party in the UK. And the Labour Party, correct me if I'm wrong, would be sort of the equivalent of the Liberal Party here in Canada.
No, that's what
Uh,
people think. That's not the truth.
oh, okay.
There used to be a Liberal Party in the UK, but that no longer exists. There's
Okay.
only a Socialist Party, which is Labour. People forget Labour is a socialist party.
Yeah.
It came into being through the Fabian Society, which is a socialist society. It's not a
Hmm.
Marxist society. It's a different kind of socialist society. They're incremental. But there
Yes.
is no liberal party. The only liberal, I guess you could say, the only liberal party in the UK or liberal party of liberalism would be the Tories.
Yeah, and I guess maybe that's where I was going because I didn't, despite their name in Canada, the Liberal Party of Canada, I think you remarked on this too, don't seem to be particularly liberal in the classical sense, you know. They have kind of aligned themselves more on the socialist side of the equation, and especially in recent years. And then you have the NDP as well in Canada. So, this idea, though, that there is this movement, a global international movement towards socialism. In Canada, it's had a presence for 100 years. It's quite
Yeah.
strong in the unions. But that's at the kind of more grassroots or worker level, you know. It's more maybe militant. They're willing to send their flying squads to, um, demonstrations where parents are advocating for their children to, violently rough them up, that sort of thing. That's at that level. But then at
Yeah.
this other level, at the political level, there's this more incrementalist, maybe more sophisticated, the university kind of class of people working ultimately towards the same goal. So, but you have this,
Yeah,
from
that's how I
both
see it too. It's
ends,
kind of
and it's
coming
kind of a
from both.
pincer. It's a
Yeah.
pincer movement, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
if, okay, so this is, I'll say something maybe a little bit controversial.
Mm.
I'm not mad at Donald Trump. I'm not mad at the USA because let me explain why. America right now is going through a resurgence of like a freedom resurgence, right? It's like reacquainting itself with its constitution, with its freedom principles, and maybe we'll see some freedom fries coming back and things like that, right? They're very, very pro-America, and they're rekindling this spirit of freedom, like you were describing the word freedom. Now, if you're doing that, and all these executive orders are coming in, and it's all about making America great again, and all this stuff, and you're reviving your country with freedom, why would you not address the problem of your socialist top hat, right? You have a distinct threat of communism at your northern border. That's what I actually think a lot of this stuff is about. It might be about other stuff, and maybe I'm biased in my assessment, but that's kind of how I'm looking at it. Like there's a real threat to the United States. Now, I would rather not go through tariff wars and I would rather not suffer more than I am. Thank you very much. But I kind of don't blame America because if Canada decided that it actually wanted to pursue classical liberal ideals and freedom for the individual, I would want Canada to do everything it could to protect itself from the threat of authoritarian tyrannies. So I have an empathy for America in many respects, and I'm hoping that it will bleed into Canada eventually, and we'll kind of move away from this sort of woke tyranny that we seem to be hurtling towards. But yeah, that said, I would rather not be the 51st state.
Yeah, and I would rather not be as well, but I definitely recognize what you're saying, and I think that is probably the great conflict of our time, between socialism or a collectivist approach to things and a more freedom-oriented or individualist approach. And we're kind of stuck in the middle, in that conflict. It seems Canada over the last 50 years or so has kind of allied itself, particularly more with socialism. And, with frankly, with the People's Republic of China, if you look at the relationships between the Liberal Party and Pierre Trudeau, who's the first Western leader to visit Mao Zedong in the 1970s, and now where we are today with his son as prime minister. Um, and so I can see how leaders in the United States who've just recently assumed power might regard that as a threat to them. But I think there's a long tradition in Canada itself, of people, seeking freedom, coming from other parts of the world, escaping,
Yeah.
communist dictatorships and tyrannies, for freedom in Canada, and for Canadian citizens, and I think of my grandparents and so forth, fighting for that with British subjects as well in the two world wars. So nothing is written in stone, I think, in terms of this conflict. I think we're living through it now. We'll see how it plays out, but people are beginning to wake up to the reality that kind of surrounds them. Um, there is something cultural about the desire, the inclination for socialism. It's very strong in southern Ontario, and in southern British Columbia on the West Coast. So they may have majorities in those places, but even within that, there are people who kind of question what's going on. But if you are one of those people who uh, kind of would prefer freedom to socialism, then you have to get involved in some way or
Yeah.
another, you know?
Speaking of freedom, so one of the things I found the most curious in the documentary, so to bring it back to this Communist Party documentary, if you're going to watch it and you're interested in freedom, watch it for this reason alone. At one point, about halfway through, the documentary describes that in about the 1930s, there, I can't remember his name, but one of their leaders, one of the Communist Party leaders, got in some trouble and he was put in a jail in Kingston prison, and then he got out and there was this big uproar in the west of Canada. And out of this, I guess, oppression of the communists at the time in the 1930s came what they called a trekkers convoy, not a truckers convoy, a trekkers convoy. They took boxcars, whatever that is, I'm not sure, from Western Canada, I think it was
Trains, like they
Saskatchewan.
hopped on trains. Yeah.
Okay, well, from Saskatchewan all the way to Ottawa on a trekkers convoy. And apparently there was some issues along the lines, and then there was some finalists, like six or so of those communists that ended up making it all the way to Ottawa. Um, at the end, there was a big fight between the communists and the RCMP on horses. And I swear to God, this documentary was put out 1 month before the trucker convoy, right? And the parallels between the trekker convoy and the trucker convoy are undeniably almost identical, except one of them is a bunch of communists fighting for their own right to be communists, to do communism, and the others are a group of people fighting for freedom in Canada, both doing the same thing and being so-called oppressed by the RCMP on horses, trampling on them, right, for a convoy to Ottawa. And
Yeah,
it's
I
just
thought that
so
was
curious
incredible.
that that happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that moment in the documentary was incredible. This was in 19, I think 34. They said there was a 2 month strike in Vancouver.
Yeah.
I don't know the particularities of the strike. They don't really go into it in the documentary. But then in April 1935, 1,000 striking workers set out for Ottawa on train boxcars.
But
And,
those
and
same
they were the
unionists,
trekkers.
because I'm sure there's some unions in there too, those
Yeah.
same people who would have been in unions are the people who denounced the trucker convoy.
Yeah, and these workers, these striking workers may have very legitimate reasons to go to Ottawa to, address their grievances, but they were met with, essentially martial law, like like the truckers and those who went to Ottawa in February 2022 were,
But you would
and
think they would have had sympathy. Maybe they didn't understand the history because I didn't know this even happened, but you would think there'd be some empathy because your ideological compatriots, whatever, did this several decades before and experienced the same thing from the government. But no.
yeah, I think though the difference being that, what motivated the truckers in 2022 was freedom
Yeah.
from a certain policy and program that came from a very socialistic place. It was very totalitarian. That that, they kind of support to this day and were involved with heavily, the leaders of Canadians unions in enforcing mandates. They wouldn't have been so the mandates in BC in the healthcare sector lasted until last summer, so 2024, longer than any other place in North America. And that is an indication of the strength of the unions in suppressing their own members and supporting the government in doing so. So, that's the reality, folks, whether we like it or not, of Canada in this present day and age. It doesn't mean it will always be this way. It will be unless people kind of, speak out, actually get involved in their unions, stand for election. There's currently elections happening now in British Columbia for the BC General Employees Union, 90,000 members representing primarily government workers. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, oh, maybe I should, get elected to my union local and attend the meetings and, vote on resolutions and so forth, that would be a good start. It's going to be tough. It would be a generational effort to kind of fight back, I suppose, and regain some influence and to be able to advocate for freedom and actual workers' rights, and not necessarily participate in a global political project bent on bringing about socialism or communism. But that's where things are at. So, anyways, I don't know, Melanie, if there's anything else you wanted to add. I think I just recommend people go watch the documentary, especially your review of it. I think it's quite helpful. But anything else you wanted to add on the topic?
Uh, my commentary is probably mostly shock throughout. I don't know if it's that quality in the live stream. I think I'm just a little bit shocked and surprised throughout. But it's out there. It's Communist Party of Canada. It's, I think, 5 videos down. I mean, it's actually 5 or 6. It's not that many videos in. But yeah, go watch that if you're interested in how the unions essentially became infiltrated by communists. They lay that out pretty clearly. And if you're interested in understanding a sort of different kind of ideological takeover, I cover a lot of videos on the ideological takeover of education in Canada, and that's essentially my channel, which is the Canadian Culture Wars Report. I have handy playlists that you can sift through and go have a look. But yeah, if you're interested in ideological stuff, I have plenty of that on my channel.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for talking to us today, and hopefully we can connect again sometime too.
Thank you.